There was a man who had once believed in the revolution. He had once written poems praising the dream of equality, the promise of brotherhood, and the new dawn that would rise over the ruins of the old empire. But he would later come to understand that not all revolutions deliver freedom. Some replace the shackles of monarchy with those forged by ideology, more invisible but no less cruel. His name was Alexander Solzhenitsyn. He had been a soldier, not a dissident, not an enemy of the state, but a man who fought bravely on the front lines of World War II for his beloved country. Yet even loyalty wasn't enough to protect a man in the Soviet Union. One wrong word, one private letter criticizing the regime. That's all it took. In 1945, Alexander was arrested. There was no public trial, no chance to defend himself. He was accused of anti-Soviet propaganda, simply because of a few sentences he had written privately to a friend, sentences that questioned the wisdom of Joseph Stalin. And for that, he was sentenced to 8 years of hard labor in the Gulag. What is a Gulag? Most of the world at that time had no idea. To outsiders, the Soviet Union was a mysterious, powerful country. Cold, vast, and disciplined. People knew it had prisons. But the truth about what went on inside those barbed wire fences, in the frozen camps of Siberia, in the underground cells of Lubyanka, in the nameless places where screams were swallowed by snow and silence, remained hidden. But Alexander saw it all. He lived it. In camps where men were worked until their souls collapsed. In barracks where warmth was a distant dream and a crust of bread was the only prize that meant anything. He witnessed men betray each other for survival, others cling to their humanity by sharing their last potato. He saw how fear was manufactured not by bullets but by silence, a silence so thick it could strangle speech forever. But Alexander remembered. He remembered every face, every story, every beating, every hunger pang. He stored them in his mind, carefully, quietly, like smuggled diamonds in the folds of memory. And when he was finally released from the camps, and later exiled from his own country, he began to write. Not to get revenge, but to tell the truth. That truth would become the Gulag Archipelago. He called it an archipelago, a chain of islands, because that's what the gulags were. Scattered across the vast body of the Soviet land, like hidden islands of pain. Separated by distance, but connected by the same cruelty. This book was not a novel. It was not a history textbook. It was a scream. A quiet, deliberate scream. Stitched together from testimonies, letters, diaries, and his own unbearable memories. It was truth wrapped in prose. Alexander knew the danger of telling it. Even in exile, he lived under the threat of Soviet agents, of censorship, of discreditation. The KGB raided homes of those who helped him. Some of his manuscripts were confiscated. Others had to be smuggled out of the USSR, page by page, using secret networks of trusted friends. He once said, "I would not be writing these lines if it had been possible to suppress the truth with silence. But silence is what they count on." The Gulag Archipelago revealed what no one had dared to say. That the Soviet regime had built an entire system of terror. That under Stalin's rule, millions of people were arrested, tortured, and killed. Not because they were guilty, but because guilt was irrelevant. All that mattered was obedience. Total, mindless, unquestioning obedience. The book described in brutal, poetic detail how people were arrested at midnight, dragged from their homes, taken to interrogation cells, and forced to sign confessions for crimes they didn't commit. It explained the difference between the physical torture of beatings and the deeper, more lasting torture of spiritual annihilation. One unforgettable passage tells the story of a woman who was interrogated for hours and finally broke. Not under violence, but when the interrogator showed her a forged letter, supposedly from her own son, calling her a traitor. That single moment, that betrayal shattered her more than 1,000 beatings ever could. Another passage recounts how some prisoners found freedom, not outside the prison walls, but inside them, by learning to let go of fear, to accept death, to reclaim their minds, even if their bodies were chained. Solzhenitsyn's book exposed the method behind the madness, how the state used fear as a tool, lies as a weapon, and silence as a prison even more powerful than steel bars. When the book was published in the West in 1973, it exploded like a bomb. The world could no longer pretend ignorance. The book was translated into dozens of languages. It shook intellectuals, rattled politicians, and forced even die-hard socialists to confront the dark mirror of their ideology. But in the Soviet Union, Solzhenitsyn was declared a traitor.
His citizenship was revoked, his name was banned, possessing his book could get you arrested.
Still, the truth had escaped. It was out, and the regime could not silence it anymore. The Gulag Archipelago changed how the world viewed the Soviet Union. It exposed the myth of the workers' paradise. It showed that the system built in the name of justice could become a machine of injustice. And it forced humanity to ask hard questions, not just about Stalin or communism, but about power itself.
Because the book wasn't just about one country. It was about the human soul.
It was about how easily a system can turn ordinary people into tools of oppression. How bureaucrats following orders can become executioners. How neighbors can become informants. And how silence, when it becomes a habit, can bury the truth deeper than any grave. Solzhenitsyn later said something that remains one of the most haunting lines ever written. The line separating good and evil passes not through states, nor between classes, nor between political parties either, but right through every human heart.
He died in 2008, but his book lives on.
Today, the Gulag Archipelago is taught in schools, read in universities, and quoted by presidents. In modern Russia, the truth is still debated, still distorted, still denied by some, but it cannot be erased. Because Alexander Solzhenitsyn wrote not just to tell his story. He wrote to tell the story of those who could not speak. Those who were buried in snow, those who vanished in camps, those whose names are forgotten.
And by writing their pain into the pages of history, he made sure the world would never forget them again.